the area from its central, of course using also, you can see this, following the lines of the city alongside the highways. In the second example, the spreading happened in a slightly different way. The Broadwater farm riots did not spread. They were contained, and also the whole police action was about containment. And this is interesting because if you look at the structure of this kind of endless structure, this grid structure of Detroit with its endless roads and its endless suburban landscape, there was also no real obstacles or no real even symbolic obstacles that would stop the oil spill. While Broadwater Farm, which was a kind of modernist acropolis in the middle of this sea of Victorian suburban housing, here it was the absolute, both the rioters and the police also saw it as the acropolis or the fortress from which they would, that they could use as a stronghold from which they could attack the areas around them, and the stronghold in which they were all powerful, and from the police point of view, the stronghold in which they should push back the rioters, because inside the stronghold it was all the black losers anyway, so it doesn't matter what happens inside as long as the suburbs are protected. So here you can see that the spread was not so much a spread, but a kind of battle zone in between the fortress and the suburb. But of course the spread here, there was spread, and I forgot to put in that image, similar to the one in Detroit, that it happened in a period of a couple of years, let's say 4 or 5 years, in which there were many, many riots in similar situations all over the United States. There were the Watts riots in 1965, the Newark riots in 1967, etc. There were many, many, a map looking suspiciously like this one. And in Britain it was the same thing. From the late 70s to the middle 80s, there were in many, many cities, a lot of them in London, of these neighborhoods, where riots happened in a similar way. Concentrations of minorities, police brutality, under, areas of urban blight, etc. So the situations were sociologically, politically similar, and they happened in a similar period at the same time, but as events they were not directly related. It was just that there was a period in time that these things happened all the time because they shared a certain condition, but there was not a direct, it's not that the Brixton riots bled into the Broadwater Farm riots, because there was more than 4 years in between them. So it's another kind of spread. Then Los Angeles, you can see a similar type of spread to the Detroit riots. With one, so there was a kind of territorial directness, so from the black areas in South Central, the riots spread out on foot, you could say. People would walk up to the street, walk down the streets and start throwing bricks or Molotov cocktails into passing cars, shops, etc. But there are two things that make this particular. One thing is that the riots of Los Angeles did not take place in a period in the United States, that there were many riots happening in cities all over the States, which could very easily have been imagined, because the condition of the black ghetto in Los Angeles was not unique. You have these ghettos in Florida. You have them in, at that point you also still had these types of situations in New York. You have them in many southern cities. You have them in San Francisco. You have them in Chicago. So the conditions were not unique in Los Angeles, and still the Los Angeles riot was a completely unique incident. So that is one thing that makes this riot different from Detroit and Broadwater Farm. And the other thing that makes it different is that here the rioters, and I'm talking just about the territorial differences because there were many other differences, but another difference is that the spread also managed to reach the extremely rich parts of Los Angeles, creating images like this, black rioters and Latino rioters coming into Hollywood and setting fire to the hip restaurants and shops frequented by movie stars. And then the fourth spread is spread-wise the most interesting or the most spectacular, and the most architectural in a way, because it started in a very particular high-rise suburb, Clichy-sous-Bois, in the northeast of Paris. And then it spread in the first days to all these points. So it did not. So here you could say, does it spread territorially or not? Does it spread directly? But it's yes and no. Its first days it spreads all in one contained area, but with enormous distances between the points. And it happens very fast. So there is a direct connection in time from the original event to the points around it. But there is not a direct relationship geographically. It's not like the rioters, after having set fire to Clichy-sous-Bois, walk down to Tremblay and start setting fire to that from whence they go to Sévran and go ahead there. It's a kind of strange hybrid between what you saw in the United States and in England over the entire country, and then in a period of 5 years, so that all these people say that they have the same conditions, and out of the same conditions the fire erupts without that there's a direct relationship. Here the fire erupts immediately and at the same time in all these points, not directly combined with each other, but still in one area. And then you have the most fascinating thing. Then, so from this, you can see it like this as one, the Pac-Man image of the riots threatening to eat Paris. But then, because they are connected not territorially, not directly in space, but they are connected by their condition and by their architectural surroundings and by their, of course, their ethnic makeup and their social and political and economic position. It was so easy that if something could spread from one high-rise suburb to another one around Paris with 4 kilometers in between them, why could it not spread just like that from a high-rise suburb near Paris to a high-rise suburb 400 kilometers away in Lyon that also looks exactly the same? So then at a certain point, after 2 or 3 days, distance evaporated and the riots spread through the virtual space of the internet and the media. It spread over the entire country and created this as one riot zone. Which brings us to the media, the role of the media. Now, in the first riots, the ones of 1967, we have the basic, the network news and the print media, the newspapers that offer, well, the classic, of course, some of the newspapers are more progressive, others are more liberal, but they all offer a kind of informed, a kind of filtered and informed overview of the riots, the newspapers, and of course this is Detroit, mobs burn and loot 800 stores, troops move in, emergency is on. A kind of, so it really reports on the riots. And of course there are at that time not very, at that time not as much as now, but there were also, of course, news reporters on the riots, so you could also have moving images on the news at night about these riots, and everybody would watch in horror. In England, you could say more or less the same. News reports on television on the riots, but what you also can see is the tabloid newspapers play a role here. The tabloid newspapers in Britain that in the 70s and 80s were all already very politically positioned, and that also they had a role of maybe not so much inciting violence, not that, but to play on the kind of existing prejudices of their readers. So you have newspapers like The Sun or who do not offer a kind of overview, but to immediately grab the riots and show them and see the world is going down the drain. So there's a much more political and much more, how'd you say, much more partisan use of the news, but still after the fact. And then in Los Angeles you can see it turning around. In Los Angeles you can see how the media was not at the back, was not after the fact or during the fact, but the media happened before the fact. You can see that the media here was one of the causes, one of the triggers. The media was in a position and in a place to play a very active, triggering role in the violence, and also to keep the violence and the fire burning. So, for example, you did not just have the extreme, how do you say, directness, the extreme, sense of being live. You had that, so that everything that you saw, everything that was happening in the riots was happening directly on the screen. It did not happen. Somebody filmed it, edited the tape, brought it to the studio, waited until the news program happened, and then broadcasted it. No, it was permanently broadcasted live, everything. So there were people who were actually living inside the riot areas, watching the riots take place on television. So they heard the noise of shooting from their television screens and from their doorstep at the same time. The most famous example of that is the example of the, what was he called, Reginald Denny? The guy who was dragged, a truck driver driving down the street, being stopped by the rioters, dragged out of his truck, and they tried to kill him by throwing rocks on top of his head. This happened, and then a person was sitting there watching television inside his house, saw it happening, recognized his own street corner on the television, runs out and tries to, and saves the guy from the rioters. So you can see here how the kind of virtual media reality of the riots and the actual physical spatial reality completely was mixed up. And of course, then we are talking about the beginning of the duration of the riots, but the beginning of the riots. Another thing, of course, was the